Dyer wave
3.
Science comes out of medieval universities. This may be totally lost on modern people, but no, actually modern science comes out of universities. Guess where universities come from? Byzantium. What is the theology of Byzantium? Orthodoxy. The longest running empire, the most successful economic empire in the history of the world was Orthodox. It was Byzantium. So we give universities, we give civilization, all these things come from the treasures of Orthodoxy. So I would say that we can prove that our morals, our theology is from God. I'm not saying that just because of history it proves it. I was just rebutting certain points that he made about history. We've actually built civilizations. Canon law is very important in the history of law. History of law theory, universities come from Orthodoxy. So when we reject dialectics and dialectical tensions and the presuppositions of dialectics, which are the very root of all Gnostic systems, are all built on dialectical tensions and the assumptions of dialectics, all the way back to Plato. When we reject that, what we're left with is a unique revealed anthropology and a unique metaphysic, a unique worldview, a unique ethic that is not just in theory. It's actually been proved and stamped into history in the longest empire in the world.
Dyer wave
3.
We've learned so much. If you've been on the Jay's analysis ride, a lot of you guys are new. I understand. That's cool. Glad to have you here. But some of you have been with me for the long haul. In fact, there are some who've been with Jay's analysis for 10 years, reading it back in the day. And we've come a long way. We've come a long way. All right, welcome. What's up? We're here. We're doing it. And the partying boomers above me are as well. So I apologize for the preacher hair again. I don't know why I have a bad case of preacher hair again. But I'm not a preacher. So let's get that straight. I'm not a preacher man. I am not Pat Robertson. I know a lot of you believe that we are more or less equal in handsomeness, probably. I am not Benny Hinn. I am not Benny Hill. Maybe I'm more Benny Hill than I am Benny Hinn. I don't know, but I'm not a preacher man, and don't mistake me for one, despite this. I mean, it's funny that I've either got Vanilla Ice or preacher hair, or maybe Vanilla Ice could become like an evangelical megachurch pastor, and he would have, if Vanilla Ice was a preacher, he would have this. Yeah, so we're going to do this kind of a classic text, and we're doing this because a lot of people ask for introductory level stuff, right? So we did 2 streams in the last week that were pretty in-depth, pretty heavy-hitting, hard hitters, heavy, well, I won't say that, but a lot of people say, well, that stuff is a little too advanced. What about introductory, kind of easier approaches to this topic? Maybe I've never read about the papacy. Maybe I don't know about the history of the church. And especially for Roman Catholics, this is a perfect book because this is written by a guy and his wife who come out of the traditional Catholic world. And so the book is basically comparing the 2 models of the church, the 2 paths, papal monarchy and collegiality. Now everybody knows that at Vatican II, collegiality became a buzzword, and it became this move to try to kind of reintegrate, right, the church into a collegial model and not just the Vatican I papal model. And that's for many reasons, but partly because of legitimate discoveries that were made in the last century pertaining to forgeries that had propped up the Vatican I mindset. It had to do with admitted facts relating to the limitations on jurisdiction for the Bishop of Rome in the 1st century, something that we covered in the last stream that makes up the Chieti document, the Chieti document covering the fact that the Bishop of Rome did not have universal jurisdiction in the 1st millennium, admitted in paragraph 19 of that document, signed off by Rome. And it's not all just everybody being factual and honest. There's also the element of ecumenism, which also has a lot of varying degrees of influences on the part of liberals. There's the geopolitical influence of ecumenism from powerful, wealthy families, the CIA, etc. So there's a lot of different reasons why Vatican II promoted the notion of collegiality. But I think one of the key takeaways is that the admission of collegiality is really a concession to the Orthodox argumentation for the last 1,000 years. And the admission that there's not this overwhelming amount of evidence in the first 1,000 years for the universal jurisdiction of the papacy view also backs up the Orthodox perspective. It vindicates that the fact that the Orthodox were right all along. Think again of revisionist works like Father Francis Dvornik's book, Rome and the Byzantine Schism, the Phocian Schism, which is referenced in the notes of Welton's book. One of the books I read back when I was first looking at Orthodoxy, I read Dvornik's books. And I've also, by the way, haven't forgotten, I know I promised a long time ago, a lot of people don't know that Dvornik has a classic work on espionage. And it's the history of intelligence agencies going back to the Middle Ages and Byzantium. And it's a great work, and I don't even remember who sent me. Somebody printed out the whole thing and sent it to me. I think they wanted it back, but then I never sent it back because I don't remember who sent it. So we will eventually get to that awesome book, because that's areas of history and information that no one has covered. I mean, that book is rare. It's out of print. I looked for it for years. I even tried to go to Vanderbilt's like secret libraries, and they wouldn't let me in there because they had it on their listed in their card catalog. So, and the reason that book is relevant is because Dvornik was one of these Uniate scholars who basically vindicated, Mark of Ephesus, Saint Photius, Palamos, all of these Photius, right? The pillars of orthodoxy in the Uniate world, which basically allowed the papacy in the 20th century to cave to this and say, oh yes, by the way, all of these people who we considered as heretics for many centuries, they're all cool now, by the way. And so Dvornik's book is great for that. Although I will say that when I read it, when I was Roman Catholic, I was still kind of early looking into orthodoxy and on the fence. And so the first few books I got when I was Roman Catholic started reading a little bit of Basil and Gregory Nazianzus. So I was interested in the orations, and then I read Philip Sherrard. The first one I read was Philip Sherrard's Greek East, Latin West. And the first time I read it, it went over my head. I didn't understand the energies doctrine. The rest of the book is history, so I understood the rest of the book. But the chapter about from philosophy to theology in the Latin West went over my head because all this energy stuff was brand new. That was about 2007. Then I read the Meyendorff book, Byzantine Church or Byzantine East, and that was an interesting introduction. Some of that went over my head too because I didn't know the nuances of Orthodox theology at all. And then I read Dvornik's book, and all that did was kind of give me the impression that actually maybe we trads had been wrong, because the trads really hate, the Orthodox stuff, right? And they're the ones that really don't want to admit any kind of resuscitation of Photius, Palamos, and Mark of Ephesus. And the logic is obvious. The trads at least understand that if those people can be resuscitated to become saints after being heretics for centuries, the founders of, quote, an entire schism of the East, then the Roman Catholic Church is no longer the true church because it has erred significantly for failing to understand that these great heresiarchs and schismatics were in fact, they were actually saints. And how contrary is this, of course, to Cantate Domino at the Council of Florence, which says that even if you die outside of communion with the Roman pontiff for the name of Christ as a martyr, you still go to hell. So the trads at least understand that it doesn't work unless it's a house of cards built on no contradictions. So to get into the book, and I don't know, this book kind of goes in and out of print. So part of the reason we're doing this analysis is because I don't know if it's in print or out of print at the moment. It pops up and it goes away, and who knows. And once we cover a book here, it sells out. Multiple Orthodox books are out of print now because we talk about. You would think that the Orthodox publishers would be like, loving me or whatever, but at least Father Peter here is his publisher. He likes what we do here. So anyway, so Welton begins the book by talking about he and his wife's experiences in the Vatican II Church. And anybody who's no, that wasn't me farting, by the way. Somebody asked. That's this chair. I'm in here. I'm in here in a boomer condo with cold ass tiles on the floor. And so if I scoot this chair, is not me violently assaulting you with gas. That's not me. I would never do such a thing. How dare you accuse me of doing such a horrible. What do the feminists call it? Feminists call it fart rape. If you're a dude and you pass the gas near a feminist, she will say it is fart rape. I'm not joking. That's an actual feminist thing. So Welton discusses the fact that the first catalyst for he and his wife to begin to question Roman Catholicism in the 70s and 80s was due to the liturgical reforms. So they are, I guess, a bit older. I don't know these people. I've never talked to them. But it's a book that's kind of, been going around in Orthodox circles for many decades. And they pointed out, as I think anybody who had time in the Roman Catholic world knows, that the first thing that really irks you, especially if you convert from something else, like me going from Protestantism to Catholicism, you don't want to see hippie masses. You don't want to see hip-hop masses. You don't want to see puppet masses and clown masses, all of which are very common in the new rite of the Mass, the Novus Ordo Mass. And so he talks about all of those struggles that they had, and how they had a hard time getting questions answered, and how they had a hard time dealing with the just overwhelming prevalence of these insane liturgical abuses that in many cases go beyond Protestant and Anglican services, right? Even today, probably a lot of Protestant, Anglican, Episcopal services are more reverent than a lot of these wacko Novus Ordo clown masses. Not always, but in some cases. And so, he kind of talks about some of the traditional critiques that were very relevant of the new rite of the Mass, from the comparisons to Thomas Cranmer's reforms in the Anglican liturgy. So Cranmer wanted to get rid of a lot of things because he knew that lex orandi, lex credendi, right? The law of praying is the law of believing. So if you want to change the faith of the masses, the people, you change the liturgy. And so the alteration of the liturgy, Cranmer understood as the Archbishop of Canterbury under Henry VIII's schism. He knew that this would change the faith. And that comes to the fore you probably heard of this book. I have this book. Got it back when I was a trad. Cranmer's Godly Order, and all the trads like that book because it shows the alteration of the new Mass is a direct parallel to the alterations that Thomas Cranmer did to the Anglican liturgy. So you're literally doing an Anglican, not totally, but very, very similar patterns, right? And so he goes on to talk about that Monsignor Klaus Gamber, the liturgist and historian, Roman Catholic liturgist historian, talked about how there's the intentional desire on the part of the revisions of previous liturgies to get rid of the notion of sacrifice in the Eucharist, and to make it more like the Lord's Supper. And in fact, many Catholic historians and liturgists have pointed out how this is well known. There were many Lutheran and Anglican liturgical consultants at Vatican II helping to draw up the new Mass. So this is not conspiracy theory. It's very well known, well attested to. And so they go on to talk about the different liturgical scholar. And if you come from the trad world like I was in for a while, there's books like Michael Davies' trilogy. There's Attila Guimarães' books. All of these books, all the SSPX books, they all kind of rehearse all these same critiques and arguments, which are not terrible. Many of them are correct, right? Because there was clearly the attempt to Protestantize the liturgy of Vatican II, and they were successful in doing that. And keep in mind, Vatican II is not optional for Roman Catholics. I have a whole video we did some months ago demonstrating that it's a total trad myth that Vatican II is optional, that you don't have to accept it. Vatican II is mandated in every church in the Roman Catholic world, and it's from the chair of Peter. It's been stated at least 4 times to be dogmatic and magisterial teaching, and the fact that Paul VI called it a pastoral council has absolutely nothing to do with whether you have the right to object to it or not, and you don't. Plus, there's 4 statements saying that it's dogmatic. So, he in this introductory chapter is really just rehearsing a lot of the criticisms and concerns that every person who's serious about the faith in the Catholic world goes through. I felt this, I experienced this. And then he kind of gives a brief description of his journey of the things that he began to learn as he studied this perspective of the Orthodox Church to the first 1,000 years versus the Roman Catholic view. And so he talks about some of the first things that surprised him were to learn that both unleavened bread, let me see what he says. For instance, leavened bread for the Eucharist was also used by Rome for the first 800 years. Likewise, Rome practiced Paedo communion all the way up until the 12th century. So these are clear alterations and innovations. Why would we not give communion to children. Makes no sense. And the entire early church does this. It's a universal norm in the church. And then he's pointing out that I started realizing that these are key alterations that I didn't even know about. Yeah, exactly. I didn't know that either when I was a trad. You learn these things over time. You realize, oh, actually, maybe we don't have it all figured out. And then he came upon quotes that really challenged the Roman Catholic notion of the papacy in, for example, St. Ignatius' famous quote, "Where the bishop is, there is the Catholic Church." And I'm paraphrasing the full quote. But there's another great quote that he mentions from Jerome, letter to Evangelus. And it shows that fullness of Catholicity, which according to Roman Catholicism, especially post-Vatican I, is really seen in the See of Rome alone. And not wherever the bishop is, the local bishop. And so that decentralized locality view, which is clearly expressed by St. Ignatius, no mention of where the bishop is in communion with Rome, there's the Catholic Church. No, where the bishop is, there's the Catholic Church. Jerome likewise says, it is not the case that there is a church in Rome and another one in the other parts of the world, Gaul, Britain, Africa, Persia, India. They all worship one Christ and they all observe one rule. If you ask for authority, the world outweighs its capital, Rome. The world of the bishops outweighs the authority of the Bishop of Rome. Wherever there is a bishop, whether it is in Rome or in Gubium, or whether it is Constantinople or Regium, or whether it is Alexandria or Zoan, this dignity and the priesthood is one. Neither is there any command of wealth nor the lowliness of poverty that makes him a bishop or less a bishop. Every bishop is a successor to the apostle. There's no super bishop. Every bishop has the fullness of Catholicity. And that's from St. Jerome, whom, of course, Roman Catholics love to quote mine and take quotes out of context for. Also, he mentions the stage that many of us come to, which some of you might have even come to in the last week or two, where you heard me going through the canons of the councils. One thing I didn't cover, which is part of the canons of the councils, is the apostolic canons. And these are canons that date to the early 2nd, 3rd century, 4th century that eventually kind of gain acceptance throughout the church and are attached to some of the later councils, I think the 6th, Trullo, and the 7th. And the reason I didn't go into those is that the Roman Catholics kind of just hand wave those. They don't really care. But given the fact that they were widely accepted in many parts of the Eastern Church, and keep in mind, the majority of the church in the first 7 centuries is Eastern. It's not mainly in Rome. Most of the bishops, the seat of the empire, and most of the people speak Greek because the Eastern Church is the largest, most prominent church, not Rome. Rome had a primacy of age and honor. But some of the other churches had age too, like Alexandria or Antioch. The witness of tradition is that there is only one, and that is me, according to Pius IX. So this is a famous quote from Pope Pius IX in terms of his view of the papacy and how it is the embodiment and judge of tradition. And that is, in fact, the opposite of what we see, for example, in, as I said, the apostolic canons, which Canon 34 reads, "The bishop of every nation must acknowledge who is first among them and account him as their head, and do nothing of consequence without that consent. But each may do those things which concern his own parish and the country places which belong to it. But neither let him who is first do anything without the consent of all, for so there will be a unity of mind, and God will be glorified through the Lord and in the Spirit." And so we see that there's nothing about the Bishop of Rome having this supremacy. In fact, that's spoken to all of the bishops anywhere in the world, having that decentralized, collegial attitude. And he mentions an important encyclical from Pius IX, which, of course, would be relevant to uniates or people that think that they can reject Vatican I. Pius IX, the Pope of Vatican I, wrote an encyclical called Lux Veritatis, and it's about the schismatic Easterns or the Orthodox Church, separated Easterns. And what's funny about it is that it makes a lot of appeals and arguments to, again, things that are admitted to be forgeries. For example, there's forged quotes from Cyril that nobody accepts anymore in regard to Ephesus. And then it also, kind of going along with Satis Cognitum and what's in Vatican I, it has this idea that everybody at all times always believed this. So remember, it's not just Vatican I, it's also Satis Cognitum, it's also Pius IX, that say that the Petrine supremacy doctrine is not something that evolved. Now, I say that because many Roman Catholics default to Cardinal Newman's argument that the papal doctrine evolves. It's a seed, it grows into a tree. And they have to do that precisely because of the lack of evidence for this position in the first 1,000 years, and because of the wealth of contrary evidence that contradicts the notion of universal jurisdiction and supremacy. And so they will retreat to the opposite argument that modernists make, ironically, that doctrine evolves, it develops, and so the papacy is the thing that was in a seed form in the first 1,000 years of the church, and then it becomes a tree by our day, thus Vatican I is so late. Now, just think of the absurdity of this. The foundational doctrine of how we know where the true church is literally like the last council, right? Except for Vatican II, right? Wouldn't that have been the first council? Wouldn't this have been in the creed? There's nothing about Peter, nothing about the chair of Rome in the creed, and yet the creed is supposed to identify the marks of the church. So it identifies the marks of the church with nothing, without anything to say about the See of Rome. And by the way, the creed that the church uses is produced at Constantinople I, which is the council called and convened and had out of communion with Rome. So this is just ludicrous, right, when we know our history here. Now, again, I like the fact that Welton stresses the fact that if you really want to be a traditional Catholic, you can't argue that the papacy developed. Okay, the universal supremacy jurisdiction doctrine is not a development. In fact, Vatican I and Satis Cognitum explicitly exclude the theory that the papacy is a gradual development. And Welton stresses that, which is an argument you hear me stress a lot as well, because it points out the contradiction in Roman Catholic apologetics, because half of them, and some of them will even say both, they'll contradict in the same debate. They'll say the same contradictory thing, that it was always there, but it wasn't always there and evolved. So both of these things can't be true at the same time. But, Roman Catholic apologists are not known for clear-headed logical thinking. Now, I like that he just kind of dives in and starts to treat some of the kind of classic clickbaity quote mines that we hear, right? The famous Rome is spoken, the case is closed. And this is a classic quote mine that is easily demonstrably false, because when St. Augustine is talking about that, he's not talking about the fact that the case is closed because the Bishop of Rome unilaterally spoke. It's actually, he's stating that 2 African councils rendered a judgment against the Pelagians, and then those judgments were sent to Rome, and then Rome agreed. And so St. Augustine is saying that the collegial attitude of the church, all of us, right, have consented to this, and the case is closed. So it's not this unilateral quote that everybody just sent the question to Rome, and Rome answered the question, and the case is closed. So, and that's how every Roman Catholic interprets this stupid thing, right? Totally out of context. And in fact, what they forget is that Pope Zosimus actually restored Pelagius. And Augustine and the African churches did not hesitate to vigorously oppose him by calling a council at Carthage where Pelagius was anathematized. So Augustine and the African synods are actually operating in rebellion to the fact that Pope Zosimus erroneously for a time restored Pelagius. Eventually, Pope Zosimus backed down from this and issued his own condemnation of Pelagius. Catholic scholars have uncovered this error 100 years ago. Thus, Catholic historians like Warren Carroll are in full concurrence. So they mention this, they're aware of this. He gives citations about this. Thus, the popular mythical remark, Rome is spoken, the case is closed, is not a neat, concisive, and conclusive statement of papal infallibility and supreme jurisdiction. St. Augustine had ample opportunity throughout his works, his voluminous works, to express anything remotely close to the notion of universal jurisdiction for the Bishop of Rome, and yet there's nothing like this. There's mention of apostolic sees, there's mention of all of the sees, and in fact there is Rome's supreme authority is not a single word. It should be mentioned that when St. Augustine refers to Rome as the apostolic see, he is not referring to it having any special power or authority or title. Quote, the Christian society is diffused by the propagation over all of the world by the apostolic sees and the bishops who are in them. And then it goes on to note that, as with the fathers of the early church, St. Augustine recognized that general councils have the highest level of authority. In the dispute with the Donatists about baptism, he does not condemn Cyprian for refusing to simply submit to Pope Stephen of Rome. And if you know that controversy, there's a controversy between Bishop Stephen of Rome and Cyprian very early on over a question about baptism. And Cyprian disagreed. Now, ultimately, Cyprian was was wrong, right? The church eventually sided with Pope Stephen. But the point is that, number one, Cyprian didn't believe that he had no ability to correct the Bishop of Rome. And St. Augustine does not fault St. Cyprian, who was in error, for disagreeing with and arguing with the Bishop of Rome, which he would have done if St. Augustine believed in papal supremacy, which was the whole point of the out of context Rome has spoken quote. So in other words, they'll take the quote line, ignore everything else in the people's lives, all the rest of their letters and writings, which don't give any credence and in fact contradict this idea, but they don't care because here's a quote that says Rome has spoken, the case is closed. And you'll notice that just like Protestants in their quote lines to prove whatever their pet doctrine is, Roman Catholics do the exact same thing when it comes to papal supremacy. They literally don't care. They don't care about the context. They don't care what the council says. Just take the quote. In fact, the Synod of Carthage, held in 418, which saw itself as completely independent of the Church of Rome, passed the following canon. If priests, deacons, and inferior clerics complain of a sentence against their own bishops, they shall, with the consent of their bishop, have recourse to the neighboring bishops. And then it goes on to talk about the primates and the councils and synods. But whoever appeals to a court on the other side of the sea may not again be received into communion by anyone in Africa. For St. Augustine, appealing a judgment from Rome to a universal council of the church was legitimate. In Epistle 43, he notes that there still remained plenary councils of the Universal Catholic Church, where the cause could be sifted and the judges themselves could make a decision. And so that would have been the perfect place to say, all we have to do is ask the Bishop of Rome. Does he say anything about that? No. In fact, he says that just as they had done, not accepting Zosimus's restoration of Pelagius, that they could have a council or a synod. Next, Welton goes on to discuss the ratios and the different interpretations of Matthew 16, because of course Roman Catholics made a huge deal about Matthew 16 as if that was just like the open and close, right? Open and shut case. That the Bishop of Rome is what's meant in Matthew 16, basically. But what's interesting is that when we get into the various collections of church fathers' writings analyzing Matthew 16, 80%, some 80% of them give it an interpretation other than just the person of Peter. There are a few fathers that believe it is. But what's interesting about that is that, well, I thought, Vincent Lorenz says that we would follow, what is it to be Catholic? It's what's believed everywhere at all times, right? Now, obviously that doesn't mean literally that we only follow, because sometimes a lot of people can be in error. Sure, we admit that. But it's just funny that even Roman Catholics will believe, they'll cite St. Vincent Lorenz, but that doesn't apply when it comes to the exegesis of Matthew 16. Now, many church fathers, as we've seen in the Orthodox tradition, they simply say that all the bishops everywhere are Peter. St. Cyprian says this, and we have Cyprian mentioning the collegial structure, and Welton gives multiple comments and quotes from Cyprian pointing out that in the earliest days of the church, right, St. Cyprian disagreed with Pope St. Stephen, pointed out collegiality. And what do Roman Catholics do? They quote mine St. Cyprian to try to prove papal infallibility. I mean, everything that Cyprian's doing is contrary to papal infallibility and universal jurisdiction, and he clearly teaches synodality. But it doesn't matter because, again, for the proponents of the quote mines, context doesn't matter. So, by the way, if you want to support the stream, you can send super chat questions here, and I will get to those here in a moment. We also have the notion of, which you heard me point out, patriarchates, patriarchal sees, and how that's kind of a movable relationship. For example, Jerusalem is not accorded a patriarchal relationship until Chalcedon. But what's interesting is that in the book of Acts, it's clearly Jerusalem that is the mother of all churches. It's not Rome, it's Jerusalem. And who's the bishop of Jerusalem? Well, it's James, not Peter. And so even though Peter and Paul are the founders of the Church of Rome, by the time of Vatican I explicitly says that you cannot say that Rome has a doubly apostolic authority or honor because of Peter and Paul. It is only because of the Petrine succession. And that's why it's very important to go back to Acts 15. And I'm just going to summarize, right? I'm going to assume that most of you guys can read Acts 15 on your own. You'll notice that in Acts 15, when they're making this decision about how Gentile converts are to be received, Acts 15 is the classic perennial text for conciliarism. Because, number one, if the Vatican I mindset was the case, if we're going to agree with Pope Leo and Pope Pius IX in Vatican I, that papal supremacy was always known in every age, at all times, and that it was immediately conferred by Christ to Peter, that's how they exegete Matthew 16. They're saying that that's the meaning of Matthew 16. Then why didn't the church in Acts 15 operate that way? Why didn't they just ask Peter to resolve the issue? Why do they call a council and then the letter goes out in the name of all of the apostles? There's nothing at all of a special relationship here about Peter. And in fact, Peter falls into error. As Paul says in Galatians 1, I rebuked Peter to his face because he fell into the Judaizing error. Then when we read the fathers commentating on it, like for St. John Chrysostom, for example, he has a great quote on Acts 15 in the council, noting that it's a conciliar model. Nothing about the special prerogatives of Peter. Nothing about Peter being an autocrat who just unilaterally tells everybody what to do. No, amongst other apostles, he is first among equals. And he doesn't even preside at that council. Eusebius notes that it is James, whom the early Christians called the righteous because of his outstanding virtue, that was the first of the records to be elected at the episcopal throne of the Church of Jerusalem. Peter, James, and John are thus, after the ascension of the Savior, did not claim preeminence because the Savior had especially honored them, but chose James as the righteous bishop of Jerusalem. So again, wouldn't it have made sense to make Peter the bishop of Jerusalem if this was the mother of all churches? Now, another point to stress is that look how different Roman Catholic apologists run to explain away and do all kinds of mental gymnastics about Acts 15. So if you've ever listened to or encountered Roman Catholic approaches to Acts 15, what's funny is how night and day it is with what John Chrysostom says about Acts 15, right? Chrysostom just says that James was basically running the show there, in the sense of presiding at the council and then listening to everyone, and then the council and the fathers all in a collective send out the letter. Every Roman Catholic apologist runs to explain Acts 15 in various ways as somehow either not a developed doctrine of the papacy yet, or as a million other kind of mental gymnastics. And what's funny is that no church father does what they do. If no church father is running to Acts 15 to do the mental gymnastics, then isn't it obvious that nobody in the first 1,000 years understood Acts 15 the way Roman Catholics do? Yeah, because it's one of the problem texts for them. Exactly. So I like the point that Welton notes that really the first time that we begin to see Matthew 16 as a direct reference to the papacy is not until late in the 4th century. So it's actually pretty late that Pope Damasus cites Matthew 16 as a reference to the papacy for the first time. That's Welton's argument. And then Welton goes on to point out that some of the classic arguments that Roman Catholics use are no good. We've covered them many times. For example, Irenaeus believed in universal papal supremacy. There's multiple things that contradict this. Number one, we did a whole stream with Ubi on the question of Irenaeus and against heresies. So you can go listen to that, which we did a year ago. And some of that's the material that Ubi covers. But another point is that Irenaeus says that Rome has the honor because it's doubly apostolic. And Irenaeus doesn't mention anything to do with a special charism, infallibility, none of that. He just mentions it like it's a first among equals. It's a perfectly Orthodox quote. And he also notes that when, for example, there's a reference to even earlier with St. Ignatius that the Roman Church, which has charge of the affairs in the Roman quarters. Why would St. Ignatius write that way if in his very day Pope Clement has universal supremacy? And remember that the Roman Catholic argument is that Pope St. Clement, right, early on in 90 or 100 AD, is exercising universal supremacy, infallibility, and jurisdiction in trying to talk about matters across the world. And how does St. Ignatius write to him? He writes to him as the guy who runs the thing in Rome, not the universal church in the Roman quarters. And so that's why he goes into Canon 6 of Nicaea. He talks about different early church fathers and historians like Rufinus discussing Canon 6 of Nicaea and how this is a limited jurisdiction. And precisely because it's a limiting of the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome, which we covered in the last couple weeks, this is why Irenaeus and others rejected the idea of Pope St. Victor unilaterally excommunicating the Quarto-Deciminarians. And this is attested to in multiple places and by Roman Catholic historians. And so this again shows that it is not the unilateral Vatican I view that Irenaeus has. If it was, he would not have seen fit to rebuke. All these people that they use, Cyprian, Irenaeus, literally rebuke the popes and say they're in error and don't follow what they say. And by the way, it was not Pope St. Victor, it was the councils and Pope St. Victor agreeing to the synods that eventually settled the Quarto-Deciminarian issue, Welton argues. Another point, too, is to mention that if you were to say the Roman Catholic Church in, say, the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, who do most of you think we would be referring to? In terms of, let's say we are surveying the majority of Christians in the world in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. Okay, we're going to do a survey of most of them. And you were to say, who is the Roman Catholic Church? Who do you think most of them would answer with? Now, the way a Roman Catholic typically would answer this, as I would have before I learned about this, because I knew very little about Byzantine history, for example. I would have said, oh, well, that's the papacy and everybody in the West. That's the Roman Catholic Church, right? The true church spread throughout East and West is the papal Roman Catholic Church. And it's amazing because that's completely wrong. The majority of the Christians in those centuries would have been Eastern. They would have spoken Greek. And they would have been in Constantinople or New Rome. And so they would have been known as the Romioi, Romaioi, the Romioi. And they would have held to the ecumenical councils that you hear me talk about. They would have seen Byzantium as the center of Christendom. They would have seen the emperor as the other head of the double-headed eagle, so to speak. And the model of church governance would have been synodal and would have been patriarchal. And that's totally foreign to the way most Roman Catholics think, many of whom are actually ignorant of history. And so what they're actually thinking of as the Roman Catholic Latin Church, they're thinking of the Franco-Papal Church, the Frankish Papal Church. And this is the post-Charlemagne, Avignon Papacy, post-Renaissance church. That's what they think this is the same church. It's not. It's a different church. And I like the fact that he brings up the whole point with the Carolinians, the Franco-Papal Church, Avignon Papacy, how that is all state control of the Pope. And what do Roman Catholics love to say? You guys are all Caesaro-Papists. You're Erastians. You believe the emperor is the head of the church. No, we don't. Neither the emperor nor the Pope is the head of the church. It is Christ who is the head of the church, and there are no human vicars needed for the head of the church. The Holy Spirit, by the way, plays that role. We don't need a dude to do it. So he mentions the First Ecumenical Council, Nicaea's canon. Then he mentions the Second Ecumenical Council, which we just covered in the last stream, so I'm not going to recover all that, that it was called out of communion with the Pope, convened, closed, out of communion with the Pope, basically ratified the Trinity, the most important doctrine for the Church, and it is not the Augustinian model of the Trinity that it ratifies. It is the Cappadocian model of the Trinity at Constantinople I. And it is presided over by Saint Meletius, who is a saint in the Roman Catholic Church who died out of communion with Rome. So again, multiple levels of contradiction, so we won't go into that, which I've already covered that on a previous stream. Next is the case of Pope Saint Celestine and Saint Cyril at Ephesus. And what is overlooked and ignored is all the quotes from Saint Cyril in his writings and at the council, which speak of him being equal in honor and dignity. Equal in honor and dignity with the See of Rome. And he says this so many times that Rome had to actually rely on forged quotes of Saint Cyril, which are covered on page 56 of Welton's book. Now, again, that's not surprising to us. We all know that there's forged quotes. But it's funny that because the forged quotes that try to give this deferential relationship to where Cyril is basically saying, oh, actually, Celestine has universal jurisdiction. Do they not realize that they would be contrary to the dozens of other quotes where he talks about the equality of all the bishops? Right? I mean, it's just, again, relying on ignorance, really. Now, Nestorius was already excommunicated by Rome. And that's the fascinating thing about Ephesus in regard to St. Cyril, is that if St. Cyril believed that in papal supremacy, which the forged quotes were intended to signify, then knowing that Rome had already condemned Nestorius, that should have been everybody's settled issue, right? Rome has spoken, case is closed. But as we read church history, we find so many cases where just because Rome had spoken, nobody believes that case is closed. The case might have been closed in the Roman jurisdictions, but it's not closed for the rest of the church. Again, remember when we covered the letters of St. Basil, how there's multiple letters dealing with problems in the church in Antioch, where Basil says that Rome is heterodox and has failed completely? That doesn't sound like papal supremacy, because it's not. But they just ignore all of that. They ignore all those things. And that's why, as you guys can see, hopefully by now, the entire Roman Catholic case is built on quote minds and forgeries and eisegesis of a few passages of Scripture. So yes, it's admitted by historians, multiple famous Roman Catholic historians, that they knew good and well that Pope Celestine had already condemned Nestorius, and they had no problem holding a synod to excommunicate Nestorius. Likewise, St. Vincent of Lérins recounts the history of the Council of Ephesus, that the condemnation of Nestorius for heresy was a forceful statement, but the General Council was superior to what Rome had already said. Notice the flip opposite model of the Vatican I view. In the Vatican I view, there would have been a council perhaps, and then Rome would have spoken and settled the issue. The mere fact that they have a council after they knew that Pope Celestine had condemned Nestorius proves that it's a synodal collegial model of the church. By the way, he also points out that some of the Roman Catholics have tried to cope by saying that Cyril of Alexandria was a legate of Rome at the council, and that's been rejected. Roman Catholic historians don't believe that anymore. Cyril's not a legate of Rome, and they examine anything that Rome puts out or announces. You'll notice the pattern gets examined. So they agree with the condemnation of Nestorius by Rome, but then they hold a council to condemn him on their own, which again proves synodality and collegiality. And then they continue to investigate writings, and that's what's brought up. You've heard Ubi mention this, and then Welton brings it up too, which is that when Leo wrote his tome, do you know who was the standard of orthodoxy at Chalcedon? It's not Leo. It's the opposite. It's St. Cyril, and they investigate for 5 days Leo's tome to see if it stands up to Cyril. And then when they say Peter has spoken through Leo, the full quote goes on to say he has also spoken through Cyril. So, and they give these glowing titles, right? So also taught Cyril, everlasting member to Cyril. Cyril and Leo teach the same. And so they are both equal in honor and dignity. And the mere fact that Chalcedon produces Canon 28, which says Constantinople is equal in dignity to Rome, honor and dignity to Rome, proves that it's collegial and that they didn't believe in papal supremacy. Remember when Erkebara got busted plagiarizing and lying about Leo's tome, saying that it was ex cathedra, and now he distanced himself from all that. He doesn't believe it. He's backed off from that. But he never changed his position, never admitted he was wrong, because he can't. He cannot admit that he's ever wrong about anything. And so far to the contrary, right, that they'll say, oh, he's arrogant, he's mean. Well, but I've admitted that I've been wrong before, right? So you can't at least say that, you at least can't criticize me for lacking to admit being wrong. But you'll notice in the domain of the Reason and Theology crew, which is actually an admission of academic immaturity to not be able to admit error, because everybody who studies these kinds of topics, I don't care who you are, you're going to have error. And so if you study this stuff and looked at it long enough, and especially if you've gone to school and you have like a university type of degree in philosophy or theology or these kinds of subjects, you eventually learn a degree of humility, knowing that you're going to be wrong. The topics are nuanced, right? And so when we see people like Ibarra, who doesn't have any degree in these topics, remember when he tried to say that in order to debate him, you need to have a degree, and he doesn't have one. Okay, so I don't know why he thinks he's exempted from his own criteria, but Ibarra and these people cannot admit that they've ever erred, because it's part of that. It's a weakness, is what I'm trying to say. To never admit error or to act like you've always been right is actually a sign of an extremely weak position. Next, it goes on to point out the problem with Pope Vigilius and his error at the Fifth Council. The crux of this one, of the Fifth Council problem being, after 6 months, Vigilius capitulated and reversed his previous judgment for a fourth time, issuing the second constitutum dated February 24th, 554, condemning and anathematizing the 3 chapters. And even Roman Catholic historians have basically had to admit. Bossuet says, these things prove that in the manner of the utmost importance, disturbing the whole church and seeming to belong to the faith, the decrees of the Sacred Council prevailed over the decrees of the pontiff. So there's one of the most famous Roman Catholic historians, Bossuet, admitting that Vigilius's decrees could nevertheless be perceived as heretical, and that the council was superior to Vigilius. And that the church had this attitude is proven by the Sixth Council in their condemnation of Honorius for heresy. Not for an opinion, for heresy. So that proves that the Roman See can defect. Remember, Vatican I teaches that the Pope, in teaching on faith and morals, cannot defect. He cannot teach error. And yet we have a Pope famously who defected. If you go listen to my Rockfin debate that I had on Twitter, I put the audio up on Rockfin where I debated with a Roman Catholic the other day for about 2 hours on this topic. And I finally got him to admit, I said, so basically what you believe is that the Pope is indefectible until he defects. And the guy said, yes, correct. Okay, that's a contradiction. And if you can't see that that's a contradiction, go listen to somebody else. But don't be over here on my channel because I can't help you. The Seventh Ecumenical Council and Pope Hadrian is interesting because that's the one where we have Pope Hadrian defending the council and accepting it initially when Charlemagne rejects it. So there's this strange sort of flip-flop reversal period. And the reason for this, in part of it has to do with the Frankish theologians in Charlemagne's court at the Council of Frankfurt in 794, which is a Charlemagne council. And then he's crowned emperor in the West in 800, right? By, who is it, Leo III, right? And then what happens is that this leads to a reversal of Rome's acceptance of the Seventh Ecumenical Council in toto. And that's because the Seventh Ecumenical Council accepted some of the apostolic canons. It accepts the Trullo Council, which, as we saw in the previous streams, was basically a universal council in the Orthodox Church. But it has paedo communion. It has so many statements about the limitations of jurisdictions. It has married priests. You can see that not too long after that, Rome has to reverse its stance on the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. And it has to later say, oh, actually, we don't accept that, except just the doctrine of icons. But they don't even hold to that, because not only is Nicaea II putting out a theology of icons that's pretty specific, which Rome doesn't hold to because they have all the pagan Renaissance art, Michelangelo, Vatican, etc. Clearly, in all of those things are a rejection of the teaching of the Seventh Council. In fact, they also reject the Trullo Council, which was appended to Nicaea II. And so you can see that there's this pattern of innovations on the part of Rome. That's the whole point. Next, he gets into the issue of filioque and the schism, and I've covered that in detail in many places, so we're going to pause there because we're almost halfway in the book. But hopefully you get another overview, and you'll want to get that book yourself if you're looking for kind of an introductory approach to these issues that's readable, that's not super academic and boring, and written by somebody who went from Catholicism to Orthodoxy, precisely because of a lot of the issues that Roman Catholics reach out to us about in terms of problems with Francis, Vatican II, etc. So let's go to the super chats, and if you want to support me, you can do that by asking super chats. This is a part 1. I'll have an analysis of part 2 as well. If you subscribe to Jay's Analysis, we'll get into the second half of the book, which goes into problems and issues that arise in the second millennium of Christianity, right? So the second millennium, as we get into Renaissance, Papacy, famous forgeries, which I'm sure you guys have heard me talk about. He gets into papal infallibility at Vatican I, and other historical issues. So look for that in the next couple of days, and that will be for subscribers only. But thank you guys. Be sure to hit like and share if you would. And I think that the first millennium was the most important part of this book, and so it kind of functions like a summarized approach to what we talked about in the first 2 streams. It would have been nice if Welton should have gone into more of the canons of the councils, because he really could have hammered home his argument there. He mentions a few, but it's a really brief kind of book, so it's not going to get into all the nuance and all the details. Billy Mays, $10. How far into Klaus Schwab's dystopian hellscape action plan before Jesus comes have any of the elders indicated? Well, we don't typically make a prediction about when Jesus is coming, so we don't know. And any elder that would say that would not be an elder, because they wouldn't be following Jesus' dictum that no man knows the day or the hour. So that I can't tell you, and it may not be the end of the world. We might be in this kind of phase that's like a type of the end of the world. And we've seen many of these kinds of antichrists, right? Is it an early chipping of the population? I mean, that's what they want to do. Whether they will get that done or not, we don't know. But, I mean, that is a real plan to do that. Will they no longer have babies born in wombs? That is another thing that they plan to do. But whether they will actually achieve that is a different question. Will everybody be living in Matrix-style cocoon coffins? That is what they want to do. But whether they will actually achieve that is a different issue. And remember that not everything that they plan goes through, right? I mean, ultimately, it's all in divine providence. But the devil's not omniscient or omnipotent. He's not all-powerful. He can't do whatever he wants. So he's only able to do what God permits within divine providence. So no, they can't just do everything and get everything done the way that they want, but they're definitely going to try because they're motivated by an evil force and not by good. So even their actions are at a higher level out of their hands. They don't even know what they're working for. Many of them do, but many of them are just simply serving this system, not even knowing that they're serving a higher spiritual evil. Bosnian Christian, $5. What would you say is the strongest argument for papal supremacy that Rome has? I mean, the strongest arguments really revolve around, for example, something that a legate says at a council, like at Ephesus when, the legate stands up and says, everybody has always known that the Roman See, maintains the faith. And, I forget the exact wording, but everybody's always known this, that Peter lives and judges in his successors, and the Roman See has always maintained the faith, this kind of stuff. One of the ones that they love to appeal to is Pope St. Agatha's letter about Rome being the unfailing rock and all this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of places where there is glowing language like that. In fact, there was a great couple sections here in the Welton book where he gives examples of glowing language that nobody accepts. Now, if you listen to my talks that I did on Basil's letters and the works of St. Basil, you know that we found places where Basil says, for example, that the Church of Antioch is the head of the churches, the head of the world, right? These glowing praises. There's one, for example, that Welton quotes where Cyril says to Nestorius, but this is before they gotten into all this controversy, right? Cyril says, "Beloved Nestorius, most holy, worshipful Lord and Archbishop and Father," right? Does that mean that Nestorius has some exalted status? No, not necessarily. And because he goes on to say that all are subjected to you, right? And what does the title ecumenical patriarch mean? Universal Archbishop, right? I'm sorry, it wasn't Nestorius, excuse me. Cyril addresses Nestorius' successor in Constantinople as my most holy, worshipful Lord, Archbishop and Father. Celestine's successor writes to Cyril that the whole church is indebted to him and all are subjected to you. Now, if the Pope is saying to St. Cyril that all are subjected to you, does that sound like, would anybody take that to mean Alexandrian universal supremacy? Well, on the line of argumentation that the Papists use, yes, that would be that's their line of argumentation. There's the best example is actually Pope St. Leo the Great's letter to the Roman Emperor Augustus. Because listen to Leo, the Pope, writing to the Emperor. Most glorious Emperor, from the solid rock upon which the city of God is built, right? Your Majesty's communications is beyond doubt revealed to be what the Holy Spirit is saying for the good of the whole church. So would anybody conclude that the emperor has infallibility because he's speaking by the Holy Spirit at the council? I mean, that's what Leo is saying to the emperor. Do you understand? Right? So you'll find these kind of glowing statements and praises throughout patristic literature, flowery prose, especially if one bishop is writing to another bishop, right? But you see it all over the place, and nobody would take all of those quotes to mean that they're all teaching Antiochian supremacy or imperial supremacy, right? So that's just another example. Shivery Bob, $5. I've heard Roman Catholics. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention that if you read Denny's chapter, which I tweeted the whole chapter on my Twitter the other day, the way he talks about Pope St. Agatha's letter is really good, because he points out that Pope Martin had already condemned monothelitism. So if Agatha's letter was a ex cathedra papal supremacy claim, then the council would not have investigated Agatha's letter to see if it's Orthodox. But that's what we always see. They do this. And Agatha makes no reference to Pope Martin's previous condemnation, which he would have done if they believed in papal supremacy. Exposing power. No, wait. Shivery Bob, $5, says, I've heard some Roman Catholics say that Acts 15 supports Roman primacy because Peter stands up and speaks before James. Well, so what? I mean, they love to read into it like Peter's mentioned first, therefore Vatican I, right? Or he spoke first, therefore Vatican I. But that's just because he speaks and just because he's honored at the council does not mean that he presides at the council, nor that he issues the decree. Notice that it's still nothing like the Vatican I attitude, which is that the Pope calls, convenes, ratifies, closes, and promulgates a council. That's the Vatican I attitude of how the Pope relates to the council. So the fact that Peter speaks first or stands up before James, it's just reading into that somehow supports universal supremacy and jurisdiction. I mean, it says the council promulgates this. Now, and also think too about Peter's letters. When Peter writes his letters, 1st and 2nd Peter, is there anything about the Church of Rome being the foundation stone? Is there anything about Peter being the foundation stone? Who does Peter say is the foundation stone in his letters? Christ. Does he write in the royal we with this unilateral authority? No, he doesn't, because it's not there. Exposing powerful lies, $5. Stay in that rap game, player. Thank you for the stream. Staying in that rap game, player. Gonna stay in that rap game. I don't know what I'm gonna rap, but I will. Just because you sent me that $5. I'm gonna quit all of this stuff, and I will be retiring to become a rapper. Thank you for inspiring me. Exposing powerful lies. Bosnian Christian, $5. Are there inconsistencies in the lines of Pope to Peter or apostolic succession, or is it relevant for the Roman Catholic Church? I don't know. I'm not sure what is meant by inconsistencies. I mean, there are many positions in any ancient see where there's vacancies. So there's sede vacante, vacant see periods all throughout any see before there's another person appointed to the see. So that's not unique to the Bishop of Rome. And even Protestant theologians, like Philip Schaff, I don't mean the Schaff Church Fathers set, but the Philip Schaff Church History set, for example, in the first volume, I mean, he uses the popes of Rome as a classic example of apostolic succession. If you get, who's the Anglican theologian? There's a History of the Popes by the Oxford History of the Popes. My mind is blank right now on who wrote that, but it's a famous Oxford scholar guy, and he uses Rome as well as a history of apostolic succession. Irenaeus uses Rome, right, as an example of apostolic succession. So, no, I wouldn't say off the top of my head that there's necessarily an inconsistency or contradiction. The biggest thing like that I could think of would be the Avignon Papacy. I mean, that's a pretty damning thing where literally the seat of Peter moves to France, in a palace in France for 70 plus years. And we're supposed to believe that that has no political influence. I mean, Roman Catholics, they will laugh at the East and say, you guys are Cicero-Papist. You guys put the state ahead of the church. Dude, great self-own, because during the Western captivity, when the papacy was in France for 70 years, we're supposed to believe that this was not a Cicero-Papal or a Papalo-Caesarist thing, right? Come on. That was obviously the Frankish power structure was running the papacy. Then it becomes the Medici's running the papacy. Then it becomes, right, other important families. Mr. C. Grimman, $20, and he says nothing. Well, thank you, Mr. C. Grimman. Mr. McGrimlin says nothing. Green Feathers, $20. How do I say goodbye? Is that, you said Trisha Underwood? Is that from Con Air? Somebody said that it looked like a blow dry in my hair. I go to the old lady salon, and I sit in that plastic bubble every morning. I take a bath in the morning for at least 3 hours. When I get out, I make sure my hair is still dripping wet, and I go to the salon nearby, and I sit in that old lady plastic bubble, which gives me that puff. I want grandma puff going on in my preacher do. So that's how I do it. It's not a Con Air hair dryer. It's a salon bubble. Bosnian Christian, $10. Would it be cool if you did a review of Trent Horn's chapter about the papacy in Case for Catholicism? Okay, I mean, I might try to. I don't have Trent's book, but yeah, it might be good to pick out one of those kind of pop apologetics books and do an analysis of it. But remember, guys, always you can find a lot of more in-depth material, a little more nuanced in the last two streams that we did on Vatican I and the canons. And you can also go over to Ubi Petrus's channel, where he's put out many high-quality documentaries going into these topics in detail, especially dealing with objections from Ibarra. So go over to Ubi Petrus, subscribe to him, support his work. He's doing really top-notch stuff, and he's got some great things coming too. By the way, I know the stuff that Ubi's putting out is really going to blow you guys away. And I want to remind you too that if you want to masculinize, you want to fight that soy. That is, you want to de-soy, because the people that run things are trying to destroy you. You want to go over to chalk.com and you want to get a hold of that Shilajit for clear mental thinking. You want to get a hold of that action for energy. You want to get a hold of action 2.0, I shouldn't say. You want to get a hold of that Tomcat for the mojo. You want to increase your mojo. A lot of you guys don't have any mojo. Maybe you want to start. You want to build a little mojo pile, right? You got to start like an ant building an ant fortress. Well, you're going to build your mojo fortress. You got to start with the Tomcat. Maybe you are a lady and you would like to balance out them hormones. You want to balance out that imbalances. You want to try the ashwagandha. You want to try the Irish moss. And if you go over there, they have actually stacks, and you can order like dude stacks and gal stacks, which is a great thing that they put together. Use the promo code J60, JAY60. If you don't put that in, you don't get the 60%. You want 60% off. And hey, they may not be doing, I've heard that they're probably going to pull the 60% off in the next couple weeks, maybe the next few days. We don't know. So go ahead and lock that in right now where you can get that 60% off. Chalk is an awesome base company. We love those dudes to death. They are the best. So definitely get over there and get your chalk.com to support not just me, but also you, your health, and also that base company, chalk.com. Bosnian Christian, $10. It would be cool. Oh, you already said that. Anyway, so thank you guys. Hope you enjoyed this. Part 2 will be up in the next couple of days. Hopefully I can keep churning out this content. I want to remind you guys too, please like and share, because we know the algorithm is not our friend, right? We do not get, some of the videos get notifications pop up that they get churned out, cycled through the algorithm. But a lot of the older videos especially, they're gone. Like, you can't see them anymore. They just don't show up. And, if you want full access to all the stuff that I do, you want to be on the website, and you want to be over in Rockfin, because Rockfin is, where we get into a lot of the edgier stuff that we can't talk about here. It's a great free speech platform, and you can sign up there to the link as well to my Rockfin. It's another excellent way to support me and to support a free speech based company. So sign up over on my Rockfin. You also get access to Tristan. You get access to Burmis. You get Tinfoil Hat. You get Whitney Webb. You get Richard Grove. You get Pajot is over on Rockfin now. Shout out to Pajot and Rockfin. You get all those good bays peeps over there, and it's not much. It's a flat fee of like $10, but I listen to a lot of the people over there because I learn stuff from those people. I mean, there's some high tier, high quality people over there. You know, I learned from Burmis. I learned from Richard Grove. I mean, he's doing these long podcasts, a lot of analysis. He's using a lot of our clips and videos. More power to him. Props to Richard Grove for that. So you definitely want to get over there on Rockfin. And, you know, worst case scenario, should we ever be nuked from where we are right here? Where you think you're going to find me? One day you're going to wake up and it's going to be like, he's not here anymore. What happened? I guess he's gone. No, dude. I'm on Rockfin. And we are almost to 23,000. We're on our way to 25, 30,000 followers, subscribers on Rockfin. So get over there and do that before we're not here. $5 from Is Human Milk Vegan? What's up? I recently came across videos talking about the prophecy from Elder Ephraim, and I was wondering if there is a stated view in the church about these prophecies. So some of those are valid. I would ask Father Peter Hears. I think he's done some videos on that because not everything is necessarily from him, and some of his students kind of interpreted it, and there's a lot of stuff going on. So it's not, no single person is like, there's no stated view, like the whole church endorses that. But I think that there's definitely prophetic statements there. I mean, just think about Paisios' statements, right? St. Paisios had all these statements that were really prophetic. St. John of Kronstadt, go look up his vision, his dream. That was really prophetic. It seems to sound like the clown mass to me, honestly. I mean, it sounds like clown masses, right? And that's an amazing, you know, what, from the 1890s or something when John of Kronstadt said that. So no, there's not going to be any dogmatic statement about Elder Ephraim's prophetic statements. And I don't know the status to every single statement that's claimed to be his, but I know that he was based, and I know that a lot of that stuff is valid. And I would just ask, because Father Harris has the inside skinny on that with a lot of the people over in Athos. So, yeah, and you can, you know, go to his channel, subscribe to him as well, and you can find a lot of that material there too. So, shout out to Patristic Faith as well, Father Deacon Ananias. He's recruited a lot more contributors. I noticed Dr. Bradshaw had a thing up. I noticed several other priests that Father Deacon Ananias knows that I don't know. They've got some really cool articles and essays and materials up. So shout out to Patristic Faith, and you can also follow them over there. Is that everything that I want to talk about? So anyway, I hope you guys are enjoying the daily content. I'm trying it out. I've been able to do it so far. If I'm on the road, it's so much easier to just do it on Telegram and then put it later over on like the podcast feed. So, you know, sometimes you might have to catch the daily talk show on Telegram. And that's just because Telegram is the easiest platform to like just post an audio in like 5 seconds. Steezy, $1. You missed a super chat. Okay, let's see. Who did I miss? Let me scroll back to the very beginning. Oh, I missed yours. I'm sorry. Steezy, $10. Jay, your content was instrumental in my conversion. God willing, I'll be chrismated in Pascha. Is it accurate to state that God's energies are carried out in the form of from the Father through the Son and the Spirit? Yes, the triadic mode is from the Father through the Son and in the Spirit for the movement of the persons in terms of their origin, and for the energies in terms of the movement of the energies, as well as for creating the world or any action or redemption. They all have the same movement of from the Father through the Son and the Spirit, and that's Basil's dictum, so you're absolutely correct. All right, everybody have a good night.